Good evening, everybody. Welcome to class number 3. I have a hard time keeping them straight sometimes. Class number 3 of the Princess Bride class. We're entering our bonus class this week, which I've been really looking forward to. So, okay. Quick announcements. There's nothing brand new to announce, but just to review a couple things from previous times. Don't forget that on Friday afternoon at 12:30 is my Lotro stream. That's been really fun. Last week was awesome. I went through the show. I went through Hobbiton and Bag End. We did an interior tour of Bag End and found the rabbit room and the bird and baby. And I had a great time with the stream last week. That was the second time I did it, and I'm really enjoying myself more and more every time. It's such a fun way to get to not only kind of do a tour of the visual Lotro Middle-earth, but think about the kinds of choices they're making in doing adaptations, and then also, of course, get the opportunity to talk about a whole lot of Tolkien stuff. It's a really fun way to do a kind of guided rambling commentary on various sort of themes and concepts. So, of course, we were doing mostly Shire-related stuff last time. We'll be in the Shire again this week, so if you want to explore Tookland and the Stock Road and Woody End and Budgeford, I think we'll get as far as Budgeford this week. Then you should join me. So, and the videos are up on YouTube. If you missed them, you can see them after the fact there. Again, it's a great way for you to sort of get a chance to see what what they've done in Lotro with the Lord of the Rings world. It's really interesting. So anyway, just wanted to let you know that again. Again, the address there is twitch.tv/LotroStream, all one word. That's the address. And again, it'll be Friday at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Again, Film is coming soon, the Silmarillion Film Project, which I should clarify that we are not actually producing a movie. We are discussing how we would, in theory, produce a movie. I've, of course, explained this before, but I found after recent announcements that it needs to be said again, and possibly can't be said quite too many times. So yes, but the Silmarillion Film Project is going to be awesome. I mean, it's a way that I'm really excited about, a way of investing ourselves imaginatively in Tolkien's Silmarillion material, in his legendarium, in sort of more in-depth and intimate ways than I know I ever have before. I'm really, really looking forward to it. So, anyway, Brianna says, yeah, theory, sure, I'm not up to anything. Now, Brianna, you are welcome to do what you like. I'm not going to produce a film because I can't do that. But other people can do stuff. Anyway, I'm looking forward, Brianna, to seeing what you produce. So, anyway, I'm really looking forward to that. That is planned for next Friday, a week from this Friday at 9:30 p.m. Eastern Time. We're going to do a sort of a special primetime opening episode. Our episodes are normally going to be in the same slot that Riddles in the Dark was in. That is on alternate Fridays at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. But this first episode we're going to do in the evening time. And I've kind of got my fingers crossed because I'm taking an airplane earlier that day. And I'm supposed to be home in time, but we will hope that all works out. Anyway, but Film next Friday night. So that's a week from this Friday. It's getting close. It's going to be a lot of fun. One last reminder: if you're on the Council of the Wise, if you're a part of our nominating council for the Mythgard Academy, don't forget to nominate and discuss. Go to the Moodle page, the Moodle discussion board, which you will have used before. There are a whole bunch of nominations up there, which look really interesting. I have to say, our nominating council has had this bizarre, uncanny ability to predict my favorite books in the world. And I don't just mean Tolkien because that's kind of easy, but other things, other things that the council has actually decided on and have been elected. Books like Watership Down and Dune, some of my favorite books of all time. There's been this unerring, and I'm not swaying it. I try even to stay out of the nominating and voting process entirely, so I won't even tell you which of the books listed on listed by the nominating council right now are the ones that are my favorite. But anyway, there's some really good options there, but please do pitch into that conversation. We're going to be moving forward with the nominations and into elections pretty soon, so don't forget about that. Okay, last time we were looking at Buttercup as a kind of a case study, trying to answer the question. The question I kept asking was, where are we? And it's a question I've had a really hard time sort of trying to figure out. And I'm finding myself kind of shifting around as to where I am. That is, how distant am I from the narrative? Are we being brought into this story? Are we being distanced from the story? Do we see sort of Goldman, the narrator, and Morgenstern, the theoretical Morgenstern, the storyteller, kind of pushing us in different ways there? How does this all work? How does the sort of the way that we're being asked to hold in suspension these two points of view, the point of view of Morgenstern, the primary storyteller, and the point of view of Goldman, the narrator, who is commenting on this and framing the whole thing for us? How do we see those interacting, and how do those impact our understanding? Again, not just our understanding of the story, but our relationship to the story. Are these ultimately, do these things seem to serve as sort of an obstacle to our investment in this story, or do we get invested in it anyway? And that's one of the main reasons I wanted to look at Buttercup last time, as of course Buttercup's story. Buttercup is in many ways, of course, the more central character of the two primary protagonists. That is, in the relationship between Wesley and Buttercup. It's not that Wesley isn't important, but of course we're not drawn. Sorry, I'm laughing because Nancy Fosberg says everybody wants to look at Buttercup. True. But Buttercup, of course, is our primary narrative focus. Wesley, of course, we come back to Wesley at various points, but it's really Buttercup whom the narrative follows, especially in the early half of the book. So that's why I chose Buttercup to look at as because it's very pleasant to do so, Nancy, but also because I think it gives us a really good way of seeing where are we in this book, again, especially vis-a-vis fairy tale and satire of fairy tale. Are we laughing at Buttercup or with Buttercup? Remember, those are some of the questions that we were asking. And my own sense of the conclusions that I drew looking at the passages that we looked at last time was that by and large it holds together pretty well. My sort of initial reaction was more distant. I will admit, in my first reread of this book, which I'm old enough now that when I reread books I haven't read in a long time, I'm like, hey, it's a brand new book, I barely remember it. When the time it's been since you last read the book can be measured in decades, it's like a new world. But anyhow, so when I, in my first reread of the book recently, I have to admit I did feel quite distant from Buttercup, and I wasn't really invested in her story much at all. Going through and looking more carefully, I found that it held together better than my initial thought was on first reading. The tone's a little bit odd in places. Places are, of course, quite a bit over the top. I'm thinking, of course, in particular of Buttercup's declaration of love for Wesley, right? But even that, although it does invite us to laugh at Buttercup, the way that it kind of comes around from that's not consistent. That is, the invitation to laugh at Buttercup is not consistent all the way through. We are invited, I think, to laugh at her there. But I think part of the effect of that is to sort of see how she does, in fact, change later on. I was fairly impressed by how consistent the characterization of Buttercup was. Consistent and therefore, in my mind, sort of investable. But there's still that problem at the end, the passage that we were looking at the very end of class last time, particularly the business at the end of the fire swamp when Buttercup leaves Wesley behind. And I still am left, after looking at that, with a really serious question. Where does that leave us? We were kind of constructing ways of reading that passage which would remain sympathetic to Buttercup, or which could be seen as consistent with Buttercup's emotional development as a character through the story to that point. But, of course, it's also possible that we're getting the rug pulled out from under us there, right? That we have been sort of invited to invest in Buttercup, and this is the moment where either Goldman, the narrator, or Morgenstern is basically saying, made you look, right? And pulling the rug out from under us, and now we realize, okay, actually, the investment, any emotional investment that we had in Buttercup has just been sort of undermined, and we discover that she's not the character that we thought that she was, and any kind of sympathy that we had built up with her could really fall to the ground. That, I think, is one reading that fits with what we see in that passage. So I want to kind of suspend that a little bit, because in order to really try to make up our minds fairly about that question, we really need to kind of bring to it more data from the rest of the book, and see where things go as we move along. We'll do that next time. Next time, I want to look at the resolution of Buttercup and Wesley's story, and more importantly, I want to look at where the frame brings us. In the last 3 chapters of the book, some really important stuff comes out from Goldman the narrator, especially. Some of his interruptions are some of the most apparently earnest, passionate, significant interruptions that he gives all the way through, in which he's commenting most directly, both upon the story as Morgenstern wrote it, and upon the story as he experienced it as a child in his father's reading, to the point where we actually, by the end of the story, build up this entire extra layer to some extent, right? We've got the story that Morgenstern is writing, the commentary and the sort of external structure that the Goldman narrator has given us. But then we also have, kind of in between them, the oral version of the story that Goldman's father gave, right? We have also the barber's version of the story, which is clearly different, both in its point of view and in its content, both from what Morgenstern said and from what Goldman said. So we not only have Goldman commenting on Morgenstern's story, we have Goldman commenting on the barber, his dad's story, version of the story, which is itself an implicit commentary upon Morgenstern's story, right? So it gets even more complicated by adding that extra layer, and I think that's really fun. So we're going to look at that next time too, and think about that, of course, especially thinking about the ending of the story and where the ending of the story goes with all of these things, put together. And again, we'll be wanting to come back to that question: where are we as readers left in all of this? What, at the end of the day, where are we being positioned? What are we being invited to sympathize with? What are we being invited to laugh at? Where does it really kind of leave us? Yeah, Lynn says, and Goldman, the narrator, commenting on his own personal life. Yeah, we see those things coming in more and more, right? It's easy, very easy, I would argue, to get exasperated by the introduction, right, when the narrator's just going on and on for what seems like forever with the story about his depressing life. But of course, as we go through the story and we look at his comments and the way that he keeps injecting these personal references to that story, to that frame that he established at the beginning about his own loveless marriage and fat child and everything else, we do, Lynn, begin to see the way in which the story is functioning, and his own commentary upon the story is functioning in the context of that, and it's all sort of connected together. And again, my question is, where exactly are our sympathies being activated towards him personally? Where is he positioning us? How is that working? So we're gonna come back to all that stuff. That's what we're doing next time. It's not what we're doing tonight. Tonight, we're going to pause. This is the added class, by the way. I said last time I was going to add a class. We're going to do 4 classes on the book, and then two classes on the movie. Before anyone even can ask, I'm adding one more week, and this is the week that we're at. Next week isn't the extra week. This is the extra week. Next week was where I was planning to do this week. I was going to do the Buttercup thing, and then we were going to go and talk about the end and the frame and all that stuff. But when it came to it, I just absolutely couldn't skip I realized that in pursuing my original plan of focusing primarily, of course, on the story of the central story of Buttercup and Wesley, which seemed like an obvious thing to do at the time, that I would be, of course, missing the central true heroes of the whole story, right? The two characters whose development is not compromised by the frame in almost any way. The two in whom we are invited without question to invest, and at whom we're almost never invited to laugh. The two characters whom Goldman, the frame writer, and Morgenstern, the storyteller, seem united in admiring and inviting us to admire, and whose story is the most gives us the most conventional fairy tale trajectory that we get anywhere in the story. And of course, this is Inigo and Fezzik, right? And it's this wonderful, delicious irony, right? That we get. It's my favorite part of this entire book. Not only because the two characters are really, I think, quite wonderful in their way, but also I love the way that they are introduced and the way in which they come in and take over this story. I mean, we get the amazing irony of the fact that it's not just that they're lackeys, right? Which is what they are. We're introduced to them. They are lackeys of a minor character who plays one role in this story, which is to kidnap the princess, right? I mean, they are a plot device. No, they are a subset of a plot device. They are ancillary to a plot device. Vizzini is the plot device, right? To kidnap the one who kidnaps the princess in order to have her rescued. In order, hopefully, in Humperdinck's plan, to have her murdered and precipitate the war with Gilder, and of course in Morgenstern's plan to have her rescued by Wesley. But no, so they start off as lackeys, and again, the way in which they're literally sideshow freaks. Like, well, Fezzik at least was literally a sideshow freak in that he was in a circus. But the two of them are this sort of extreme sort of stereotype. At least they appeal to kind of stereotypes, right? He's got the swordsman who's the greatest swordsman in the world, and he's got the giant who's the greatest, biggest, strongest man in the world. Which seems almost completely, again, at first glance, would seem almost sort of dehumanizing, right? They're just sort of exaggerated lackeys whose role in the story, apparently, are to be obstacles which the hero overcomes in the course of pursuing his quest, right? You've got the hero who's coming to rescue his true love, and he's got to go through these two very formidable obstacles, right? The greatest swordsman, the greatest living swordsman in the world, and the strongest man, the strongest giant who lives in the world, and that's it, right? By the end of the story, things have completely switched around, right? At the end of the story, the quest of the putative hero, Wesley, to be reunited with his true love and to save her from the clutches of the evil prince and intervene before his true love can be married to the evil prince, which is like the obvious central fairy tale plot, right? That becomes a mere accessory to Inigo's quest, right? Inigo's got to rescue. He's got to unrescue. He's got to murder Count Rugen, right? He's got to wreak his revenge. And Wesley becomes the instrument to make that happen. And the actual reunion of Buttercup and Wesley, I mean, it's pretty good, but it's relatively significant. But it's no longer really the focal point of the story. The whole story gets kind of hijacked by Fezzik and Inigo, and it becomes, Lynn, exactly as you say, it becomes a buddy story. It's like a bromance between Fezzik and Inigo, and that's great, and it's awesome, right? And I think that it's a fascinating element of this story. So in the end, I could not bear not talking about them. So we're going to do nothing but talk about Inigo and Fezzik. And to me, what's really fascinating when we look at this is when we look at first of all, at the individual journeys that Fezzik and Inigo as characters travel on in this story, and the really pretty intricate parallelism between their two stories. Of course, it's easy in many places to sort of focus more on Inigo in that he's got the quest that moves things along, right? Fezzik, in the latter half of the story, seems on the one hand to just be kind of along for the ride, right? He's there just to help Inigo, right? He's the one who pays for Miracle Max because he's the only one who has any money because the Brute Squad pays reasonably well, whereas Inigo has spent all of his money on brandy. And from that moment forward, right, when Inigo just asks, how much money do you have? And Fezzik automatically and without hesitation gives him every penny that he has in order to pay Miracle Max to resurrect the Man in Black in order to go and... it's all about Inigo's quest, right? But I still think, when we look at it, the story doesn't really spotlight Inigo and leave Fezzik behind at all. We can see the two of them. We can see the two of them really continuing side by side in a really interesting parallel journey. So that's what I want to look at today, and we're gonna go back and forth between Inigo and Fezzik. This in part to guarantee that I don't get so carried away talking about one of them that I shortchange the other. So let's look at where they start. Now, where we start with Inigo and Fezzik, as I said, first they seem like mere sort of minor, freakish, even comical accessories to the plot. But right away, well, not quite right away, soon after meeting them, we get this really clear and quite remarkable signal that there's something a little bit odd going on here, right? And of course, I'm referring to the two enormous narrative diversions that we get in order to give the family history and background, in order to give the origin stories of both Inigo and Fezzik. And it's such a strange movement in the middle of that enormously long chapter 5. It's completely unexpected. Unexpected in the sense that there's no narrative justification for it. At least none that's obvious at the time. Especially since both of them fail. Right? Neither one of them dies, of course, but both of them are overcome by the Man in Black, and the Man in Black leaves both of them unconscious on the ground as he goes by, and then we follow him and depart Inigo and Fezzik, and we have no reason to believe, again, imagining we've never seen the movie and don't know this book at all, when Wesley runs away from the unconscious body of Fezzik lying on the ground to go and meet Vizzini and overcome the third and final challenge to his rescue of Buttercup, we have no reason to believe we will ever see them again. Why should we see them again, right? They were mere obstacles that were overcome by the hero. It doesn't make any sense. And therefore, it's the more odd that we got this really intimate profile of each one and where they came from, right? That by itself perhaps makes it less surprising when we do come back to them, right? But anyway, it's pretty notable. So there's a whole lot, I don't want to pretend that I'm capturing everything in the few passages that I've chosen, and certainly feel free to refer to other bits that I'm not quoting from here. But I tried to point to passages that I thought kind of captured something about these particular moments. So part one of our 5-part investigation of the careers of Inigo and Fezzik is going to be a look at their childhoods. Both of them experience these sort of shattered childhoods, right? And I want to take a little peek at each one of those. So first, Inigo. We're going to do Inigo and Fezzik, because most of the time that's the way they're talked about, right? We fight Inigo first, then we fight Fezzik second. So that's why we're gonna do it. Interesting. Karita points out that we are given a cue to care more about them as well, because Wesley appreciates them and deliberately refrains from killing them. Yeah, you're right. That does seem kind of fitting. I mean, it would have been really bizarre. Like the whole, let me give you his whole life story and kind of make you care about where he's coming from and what he's doing in his life. If Wesley actually killed the both of them, right? I mean, that would simply become, I at that point, I would feel like my patience was being imposed upon by the author of the story, right? So you're right, Karita, that we can see a kind of nod to the investment, which I believe, again, if we're sufficiently patient not to be frustrated by the digression from the central story, the sympathy that we've really built for these two characters already. And again, there's kind of an acknowledgement, I think, of that in Wesley's own acknowledgement of them and his apparent respect for the two of them. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, Michael Jaskowski says it's sort of like Bilbo's pity on Gollum, who ultimately becomes important to the quest in the end. Yeah, it does come around kind of like that, right? Not exactly the same way, of course, but yeah, no, it is true. I mean, you think if he had not had mercy on the two of them, as he might. Arguably, it would have been more prudent to kill them both, and of course, it's the more ironic in that Wesley is the dread pirate Roberts who leaves no survivors, and yet here he was leaving survivors all over the place. But it turns out to have been a good thing, right? So, yeah, Michael, I think that's kind of a fun parallel. Sarah King says killing them both would just be very George R.R. Morgenstern. You're totally right, Sarah. That would be an absolute Gurr Martin move. Like, here's 50 pages of backstory on this character, and now he's going to die. Absolutely. Anyway, yes, Arthur says, prepare to die unless pity stays my hand. Exactly. Yeah, Thomas Johnson, of course, points out that the Sicilian, as he's very commonly called, the Sicilian's lack of a backstory portends his failure in the Iocane test. Yeah, true. Okay. But let's look at Inigo here. Now, here I want you to, again, as so often, I want you guys to be making observations, specific and concrete observations if you can. Certainly anything that you see in this passage that really strikes you. Again, my question here is, what are we learning about Inigo? There is some reason why we've digressed onto this. It's not a sheer and random digression, right? What are we learning about Inigo that's important here? What are we given that is foundational for Inigo's character in these early scenes? And if there's something that you remember from the passage describing his childhood that doesn't make it into this one little brief quotation, feel free to make an observation about that too, right? And then we'll come back and we'll look at those observations and kind of bring them together. Inigo ran forward then, this is right after his father has been killed, standing in front of the nobleman's horse, blocking the nobleman's path. He raised the six-fingered sword with both his hands and cried, I, Inigo Montoya, do challenge you, coward, pig, killer, ass, fool, to battle. Get him out of my way. Move the infant. The infant is 10, and he stays, Inigo said. Enough of your family is dead for one day. Be content, said the noble. When you beg me for your breath, then I shall be contented. Now dismount! The nobleman dismounted. Draw your sword! The nobleman unsheathed his killing weapon. I dedicate your death to my father, Inigo said. Begin! They began. It was no match, of course. Inigo was disarmed in less than a minute. But for the first 15 seconds or so, the noble was uneasy. During those 15 seconds, strange thoughts crossed his mind. For even at the age of 10, Inigo's genius was there. Disarmed, Inigo stood very straight. He said not a word, begged nothing. What do we see? What are we given about Inigo here? One thing that I would point out, notice also how even the prose style here is different than we often get. We don't get any of those kind of there are no parentheses, right? There's no, this was, this was before something, or, we don't get any of those comical asides. Morgenstern's comical asides now, I mean. We get, there's nothing funny in the language of this description. That might be an obvious thing to say, like we're just talking about like a 10-year-old kid whose father's just been murdered in front of his eyes. Of course it's not funny, but that Morgenstern's prose has often been comic even at serious times. The only sentence in this whole passage that jumps out at me as being similar in tone to the kind of slightly sardonic, quite casual, conversational tone which Morgenstern uses so often throughout the narration is, it was no match, of course. Other than that, he maintains a quite high dramatic register, which again I find comparatively unusual. But more, let's see. Hopefully, your observations are more concrete than mine. Lee, yeah, I was noticing that, especially when I was reading it aloud. Lee Smith says, "I like that Inigo gives orders and the nobleman obeys. Dismount, draw your sword." Yeah, and notice again the simplicity, the terseness of the narration there. Right, the nobleman dismounted. The nobleman unsheathed his killing weapon. We only get the one little embroidery there at the end, which emphasizes what Inigo is potentially bringing on himself, right? The cost that he is prepared to pay. It's really good, right? And so, Lee, I love that too. We see the sort of authority of Inigo at the age of 10. The nobleman, Count Rugen, could simply ride on, right? There's no reason why he would have to stay to chastise the Spanish brat, right? But he does. And we see his brief, like his 15 seconds of respect for Inigo, right? His 15 seconds of uneasiness is kind of a reflection also of Inigo's authority, right? Of his authority, I'm not comfortable with that word, stature, right? Of the respect of which he is worthy. Anyway, yeah, I think that's really interesting. Arthur says at that time he wasn't even in the top 20 swordsmen. But see, Arthur, exactly, that's precisely the kind of thing that he doesn't say here, that he might have said in chapter 2 or chapter 1, right? I mean, that's exactly the tone I'm talking about. That's Morgenstern, right? Not Goldman, the frame narrator. That's Morgenstern's prose when he's all like, at this point she was like number 8 and climbing rapidly, right? That kind of wry comical tone, which was so frequent in the early chapters, is almost nowhere in evidence. Certainly in this passage. Now, again, I'm kind of cherry picking here. One could easily argue, but still, I think it's significant. I think it's significant. Good. Thomas Johnson adds, the only wit in the passage comes not from Morgenstern, but from Inigo himself. The infant is 10, and he stays. Right? Yeah. And even that is it's like a verbal parry, right? We see him verbally fencing with the Count, right? He's just received this insult, and he knocks the insult aside and asserts himself. And it's right after that, as Lee points out, he begins making commands, right? He begins delivering orders, which the Count obeys. Very good. And sorry, Rachel Draper was making the same point about Inigo's bossiness, which is really good. Good. Inigo, as Lee says, insists on not being dismissed as a mere child, and we see this, of course, both in his standing up to him and in his parry of the infant insult, but also in that assertiveness that he has and that insistence that moving on to issue orders. He is not. He is demanding to meet Count Rugen as an equal and duel him as an equal, and he actually induces Count Rugen to descend both as nobleman to fight with commoner, and of course literally physically descend from his horse to foot in order to meet him as an equal. Okay, good. Very good. Lots of good observations. Patrick says, I love Inigo's 5 different insults for the nobleman here. Yeah. And I think not arbitrary, right? Again, that strikes me as a moment when we might have heard, in a previous chapter, with a different character, we might have heard some of that kind of sardonic Morgenstern tone coming out, right? I mean, I think, for instance, of that moment when when Humperdinck is proposing to Buttercup, right? And he says, I am your prince, you cannot refuse. And she says, I am your subject, and I just did, right? Again, it works, but there's you see what I mean by that kind of wry tone, which kind of undermines the seriousness of the situation, right? It's inviting us to laugh at what would otherwise be a very dramatic moment, recalling her grief and her resolution not to love, if it is exactly a resolution. We talked about that some. And, you know, her willingness to die rather than, you know, compromise herself for the prince. But we're not given it as a moment of high drama. We're given it in that sort of sardonic and comical tone. Not here, right? And Patrick, I think that all five of those adjectives are perfectly true and applicable names. Yeah, good. Lee says 2 of them are farm animals, pig and ass. That is bringing him down, insulting his honor, his nobility. Right? You are not high. You are not above commoners. You are below them. 2 are fighting words, impugning his character, impugning his honor, calling him coward and fool. And 1 is simply deadly accurate, calling him a killer, as he just murdered his father. It's a very good breakdown, Lee. Good. Kate Neville points out, I've always found it interesting that Inigo has been able to use the 6-fingered sword as if it were made for him. Yeah, Kate, I agree. On the one hand, the 6-fingered sword is the most magnificent sword ever made. It is the masterwork of Inigo Montoya, who is the greatest sword maker ever, but it was designed specifically in order to counteract the natural disadvantage. I remember all that talk that Domingo does about how, for a master swordsman, like the slight off balance that a normal sword, which wasn't specifically designed for a 6-fingered man, would be very significant, right? So here's Inigo, a conspicuously 5-fingered man, who's been fighting with this sword designed to counteract those imbalances, which presumably therefore create new imbalances for Inigo, since it was designed for Count Rugen. And yet he's managed to become, the wizard of fencing, despite that. It's almost like fighting left-handed, right? Though, of course, it's also like the Sword of Destiny, obviously, and the last and greatest sword of his father, so it's obviously, the legacy from his father and all that kind of thing. But, Kate, I think you're right to point to that factor, which certainly the narrative draws enough attention to that we shouldn't utterly forget it. Good. Interesting. Michael Chevskowski, Lee, he's you said this at almost exactly the same time, and Michael points out even further that the insults not only are distributed, Lee, in the way that you describe, but they're chiastic, right? That is, they're symmetrical. Coward and fool on the outside, pig and ass inside those, and killer as this sort of central point right in the middle. It's beautiful. That's a beautiful observation. Okay, good. Yeah, good. Mary Rose points out, of course, every time the sword is mentioned, it's called the 6-fingered sword. So we're never really allowed to forget that it was designed with that kind of peculiarity. Yeah. Anyway. All right. Good. So I want to move on because we got to get through Inigo and Fezzik tonight, because there's going to be plenty to talk about next time. Okay, so here's where Inigo begins, and this is the first kind of glimpse that we get of Inigo, and I think this establishes a really interesting foundation for him, for the strength, the strength, the nobility of his character, and of course, sort of framed within this absolutely shattering moment of his childhood when he loses his father under these terrible circumstances and dedicates his entire life to trying to find justice for that. How about Fezzik? Fezzik also has a shattered childhood, but it's shattered in a different way. This is in the context of his parents training him for his first fight ever, when they decide to take their 9-year-old son, who looks like he's 20, and they're going to enroll him in professional fighting in Turkey, where they're from. And the previous paragraph has just said that Fezzik's father and mother have never been more happy, right? She is overseeing his diet, and the mother's overseeing his diet, and his father's overseeing his training, and everybody's really, really happy. Fezzik had never been more miserable. He was scared and frightened and terrified all rolled into one. No matter how they reassured him, he refused to enter the arena. Sorry, catching my throat. I'm not getting choked up yet. Because he knew something. Even though outside he looked 20, his mustache was already coming along nicely. Inside he was still this 9-year-old who liked rhyming things. "No," he said. I won't, and you can't make me." "After all we've slaved for these 3 years," his father said. His jaw was almost as good as new now. "He'll hurt me," Fezzik said. "Life is pain," his mother said. "Anybody that says different is selling something." Skipping a little bit, just because I wanted to fit it on the slide. The bit that I skipped is Fezzik talking about how he's afraid he's gonna screw it up, and he's gonna forget all the moves, and he's gonna do it wrong, and that he refuses to go. "Listen, we're not going to threaten you," Fezzik's parents said, more or less together. "We all care for each other too much to pull any of that stuff. If you don't want to fight, nobody's going to force you. We'll just leave you alone forever." Fezzik's picture of hell was being alone forever. He told them that when he was 5. They marched into the arena then, to face the champion of Sandiki. Arthur asks, does anyone in this book have nice parents? Well, Humperdinck's parents aren't awful. I mean, he's got an evil stepmother, I suppose, so I guess that disqualifies Humperdinck, really. I mean, even though she doesn't appear to be very actively evil, but I love that he calls her that. Inigo, of course, does have, but Arthur was saying, other than Inigo, right? Yeah, we have that, of course. Now Kate Neville, of course, is struck by the contrast between Fezzik's parents threatening to leave him, whereas Inigo's father is taken from him. They are bound by loss of that is, Inigo and Fezzik are bound by loss of parental love and the fear of the reality. Of course, Fezzik's parents eventually do die, but this threat is worse than the actual loss. I agree. Yeah, good. Thomas Johnson points out that fairy tales often feature portraits of parents inflicting outrageous physical and psychological abuse on their children. Certainly Hansel and Gretel come to mind. The sort of passive-aggressive psychological abuse Fezzik's parents inflict on him is a more realistic version of that, even as his physical situation is ridiculous. Now, on the ridiculous point, notice how those sort of that kind of ridiculous narrative tone creeps back in here again. His mustache was already coming along nicely, right? His jaw was almost as good as new now, right? There are these moments where we're being invited to laugh, but still, it's not the same, right? The effect of this is still very moving. I mean, I can come away from the description of Buttercup's grief after Wesley's apparent death, his first apparent death. I can come away from that at least I did come away from that not especially moved. I found it a little bit more moving when we went back and looked at it more carefully in class last time. But like it wasn't. It's not like it really gripped me. Both Fezzik and Inigo are really gripping. The suffering that the two of them have that we see from their childhood. The one in the loss of what seemed a very loving though somewhat eccentric parent, and Fezzik's horrible treatment by his family, and his clear desire. His clear desire just to be loved and to be accepted by his parents and not to be left alone. Yeah, good. Brianna points out that Fezzik's parents' death is just a side note in the text, especially compared to Inigo's father. Right, it is conspicuous in the contrast with that. Yeah, good. Excellent. Kate points out that all the descriptions of Fezzik as a child are only indicators of the ways in which others laughed at him, which make us feel for him. Yes, so even in the ways in which the sort of sardonic comments by Morgenstern, the author, invite laughter, it is almost imitative laughter in that way, right? It becomes even more horrible in as much as we begin to be invited to laugh at Fezzik. That is, it's never that he becomes a genuine laughingstock, but it's almost as if Morgenstern is showing us how and why people always laughed at Fezzik so that we can have a kind of intuitive understanding of the mockery of Fezzik, even though I don't think, as readers, we are put in a position to want to laugh at him at all. And good, Philip Lord adds that Fezzik himself seems to look at himself through the eyes of others as well, so it's sort of natural that we would be introduced to him in that way. Sarah King asks, do I find this more moving because Fezzik and Inigo are children, or is Buttercup herself or her situation inherently less sympathetic? That's a good question. In part, I think the increased sympathy is the fact that we are seeing the suffering of two children, both of whom are ultimately left alone in the world. Whereas Buttercup doesn't have that. She doesn't exactly have a happy home, but her parents are both physically there and even, in a sense, emotionally there. I mean, the fact that they care about her and are tender towards her is pretty clear, I think, in the scene after, when she comes back out after mourning for Wesley for 3 days. But Sarah, I want to think about this a little bit more. I'm trying to see if I can identify if there is anything other than just the fact that it's a child. I think, well, okay, I was going to say a second reason. It's kind of the same reason, or at least maybe sort of a subset of it, but maybe it clarifies a bit. With Buttercup, I sympathize with her for the loss of Wesley, on the one hand. But on the other hand, I was never really deeply impressed by their relationship to start with. That is, her declaration of love is so comical and so over the top. Her whole like, oh, did I say I loved you 15 minutes ago? My love for you now is so much more than it was 15 minutes ago. And I'm like, okay, yeah, I hear you, and I'm less than 100% convinced that you love him truly now, right? This is, it sounds like a wild infatuation. They never get to, they never go. Then he leaves immediately the next day. Their relationship never progresses other than sending letters which sound equally sappy and juvenile. And so, do I feel like, oh, she has been left alone and has lost her true love? Like, in theory, yes, but I'm still not. It's like sad and everything, but I would be sadder, if we were looking. I mean, I would be sadder if, like, Miracle Max died and Valerie was left alone, right? That I would find sadder than Wesley dying at that stage in the story, when their relationship is so shallow still. And then things that happen to her afterwards are in large part tied up with her own choice. She chooses to marry Humperdinck. Yes, he said he would kill her if she didn't, but still, I mean, she makes choices there. She makes choices that these children, Fezzik and Inigo, they have no choice in their situation, and part of that, as I said, is not really a second reason, but just part of the fact that they're children. But they have these miseries just absolutely thrust upon them, and the death of parents, both the death of parents and the mistreatment by parents, are there in my mind just in such a different category of sort of emotional gravity than I have lost the love that I have had for several hours, and I now think is like the most transcendental experience in the world. A much harder time, really kind of kind of buying that. But anyway. Okay, Sarah, confession time. I'm wondering, I just had a doubt creep in. Am I emotionally biased against Buttercup because she's so beautiful? It's harder to feel sympathy for beautiful and or rich people, right? In fact, it's always sort of tempting to take vicarious and envious satisfaction when bad things happen to them. That's a disgusting thing to feel, of course, but it happens, right? I wonder if Buttercup's beauty itself and all of the emphasis on where she is in the rankings also distances me from her emotionally in that way too. It's like, oh, the most beautiful woman in the world, like, lost the guy she had a crush on. Oh gosh, I wonder if she'll be okay, right? I mean, that's obviously cold and horrible, but you see what I mean? There's like at least a bit of that, I think, in there. Whereas again, with Inigo and Fezzik, no way. No way. Brianna says, is this why I'm less sympathetic for Turin Turambar? He is the hottest human man ever to live. Yeah. It's not quite the same, but a perfectly fair question. Anyway, okay. Let's move on. Okay, so my first little snapshot of the parallel structure of their careers is the shattered childhoods of our two heroes. The second is the crossroads in their lives, right? The turning point of their careers, which is their meeting with the man in black. Here's Inigo before they fight. Please, Inigo thought, it has been so long since I have been tested. Let this man test me. Let him be a glorious swordsman. Let him be both quick and fast, smart and strong. Give him a matchless mind for tactics, a background the equal of mine. Please, it's been so long. Let him be a master. I have my breath back now, the man in black said from the rock. Thank you for allowing me my rest. We'd best get on with it then, Inigo replied. The man in black stood. You seem a decent fellow, Inigo said. I hate to kill you. You seem a decent fellow, answered the man in black. I hate to die. But one of us must, Inigo said. Begin. What do we see here? Right, exactly, Philip. His prayers are answered, right? This is not the first time Inigo's prayers are going to be answered. It's almost like his story goes towards a happy ending. Now, of course, it's denied. It is. He cannot have a truly happy ending under his circumstances. But more. What do we see here? Yeah. Hang on to those. Kate is trying to squeeze in thoughts about the end of with Buttercup and Wesley. Wait for it. Hold those thoughts. Come back to those stuff next week. I want you to say those things again next week. Yeah, good. We see Inigo's integrity. He really is a decent fellow. Yes, good. This is not, in as much as he's introduced to us as the lackey whose job it is to dispatch this guy who's chasing them, we do see that he has integrity. Even, it's funny, when he helps Wesley up the cliff just because he's impatient and hates waiting. But even even there, you think of the very amusing conversation between Wesley and that does put a damper on our relationship. I love, by the way, and actually, I think that this is a significant thing, which we'll come back to in a couple of weeks. Notice how many lines from the Inigo and Fezzik sections of the book are carried over directly into the movie screenplay, whereas that is true a much smaller percentage of the time with Wesley and Buttercup's dialogue. Just an interesting little thought. Toss that out there. We'll come back to it later when we talk about the movie. But anyhow, so we do see integrity on Inigo's part. But of course, this also shows us something about him himself, right? That is to say, yes, he's interested in fair play. Yes, he would like, he wants to give the Man in Black a fair shot. He's not just going. He's not a murderer, right? Yes, we do see all of those things, but we also see him desiring to. Well, this is such a corny way to talk about it, but to sort of find himself, right? I mean, he wants to be challenged. He has been, we've been told, in a pattern of discontentment. He's for a while barely even practiced. At least before he hooked up with Vizzini again, he was on this downward spiral of drinking himself to death and almost giving up swordplay because he was bored, because nobody ever challenged him. He wants, but he wants to keep getting better. He wants to continue refining his craft. So his one prayer is, let him be a true master. Let him have a background equal of mine. Let this be a real fight, not just an easy me dispatching the guy who's chasing us. Karita, he's bored with being the best. He achieves in his early training the rank. At least, Yest tells him he's achieved the rank of wizard. Right? He's the only living wizard of swordplay. Since the Corsican wizard died at sea. I wonder if the Dread Pirate Roberts killed him, or if maybe he became the Dread Pirate Roberts. But anyway, are we told the Corsican? No, we are, and I don't think he was the Dread Pirate Roberts. Anyway, point is, it would seem as if he's already reached sort of the apex of his career very early, right? But that's clearly, he's not content with that. He doesn't want to stay there, and he doesn't want, because he knows that just sort of being there and staying there sort of leads to that, that brandy fogged decline that he was in before with Vizzini. So it's interesting to see him searching here, not only searching, of course, for the six-fingered man so that he might kill him, but searching for some challenge, some improvement, some movement of himself, not just to go at the top and stay there. He's beaten by the Man in Black, but he's not crushed by that fact. He reconsiders some things afterwards, but it's not like he's going to go off and kill himself because now everything is you and I've been proven. You can see, I think, even in his words here, almost a desire that he would lose, right? Almost a desire that he would find somebody that would be better than him. Notice how also we find somebody who, that is, we find foreshadowing of what we're going to see later on, right? His prayer, let him be both quick and fast, smart and strong, give him a matchless mind for tactics, right? Well, it's exactly it's Wesley's matchless mind for tactics that Inigo is seeking later on, right? To help him in his storming of the castle to kill Count Rugen. So we see, of course, his prayer very specifically answered, but of course answered in a way that he himself doesn't anticipate. I think that's really, that's really cool. All right, where's Fezzik? Fezzik, of course, wants to be sportsmanlike, doesn't want to just kill the Man in Black from hiding, as Vizzini tells him to do. They stood facing each other on the narrow mountain path. Now what happens? Asked the Man in Black. We face each other as God intended, Fezzik said. I can't... Of course, it's really hard not to read Fezzik and Andre the Giant's voice, but I can't possibly imitate Andre the Giant's voice, so I won't try. No tricks, no weapons, skill against skill alone. You mean you'll put down your rock and I'll put down my sword and we'll try to kill each other like civilized people, is that it? If you'd rather, I can kill you now, Fezzik said gently, and he raised the rock to throw. I'm giving you a chance. So you are, and I accept it, said the Man in Black, and he began to take off his sword and scabbard, although, frankly, I think the odds are slightly in your favor at hand-fighting. I tell you what I tell everybody, Fezzik explained. I cannot help being the biggest and strongest. It's not my fault. I'm not blaming you, said the Man in Black. I find this passage really poignant. I mean, of course, on the one hand, it's a comical exchange, right? But again, I find the stuff that I see going on in this passage is the kind of stuff I see going on in Inigo and Fezzik passages so much more than in Buttercup and Wesley passages. That is, the ways in which so many of these lines have double meanings, right? And even though this is sort of on the surface, a kind of, badinage between the man in black and Fezzik the giant, there's all of these, I think, really heavy undertones. For instance, if you'd rather, I can kill you now, Fezzik said gently, right? The gentleness of Fezzik's words, like it's almost like he's offering. It might hurt you less for me just to dispatch you with a rock right here. Bam! You probably won't feel it. So if you'd rather, I just kill you now. I'm willing. So even so that, when he says I'm giving you a chance, it's almost like that has two meanings, right? On the one hand, I'm giving you a chance to fight fairly, but also, I'm also giving you the chance to die quickly, right? If you'd prefer, because he's gentle, because he really cares. He doesn't like hurting people, and he doesn't want to hurt Wesley. As Sarah Powell says, it's hard to know whose side we're supposed to be on in these fights, and in my view, especially with Fezzik, Inigo at least was wanting the fight, right? And so when they fight, it's a happy thing, right? And even in a sense, when Inigo is overcome, even that's kind of a happy thing. Like, it's not the top of the mountain. You still have somewhere to go. There's still meaning in your life, right? It's a good loss for Inigo, right? With Fezzik, it's less clear, right? On the one hand, it's still kind of a good loss for Fezzik in the sense that he didn't have to dismember somebody that he didn't want to dismember. It's like he's finally gotten out of a fight. He often kind of wished that he could lose earlier on in his career, but he never could. It just never worked out that he lost a fight. So that's also kind of a relief to him. He doesn't want to hurt anybody. He doesn't want to kill anybody. But more, especially moving, I find. I'm talking about sort of the double meanings that I was suggesting. Fezzik's comment at the end, I tell you what I tell everybody. I cannot help being the biggest and strongest. It's not my fault. You can do that as a really jocular line, right? I can't help being the biggest and strongest. It's not my fault, right? You could do it that way. You could hear it that way. But you can also hear that, I think, really movingly, right? That can be a really pathetic line in the classical sense. That is, a line containing much pathos. He can't help being the biggest and the strongest. All his life, he's wanted to help being the biggest and strongest. He's been victimized by being born so big and strong when he did not want to be so big and strong. He just wanted to be a little boy who could make rhymes, right? And instead, he was made into a professional fighter at the age of 9, right? It's not my fault. It's like being the biggest and strongest is something that he's been being punished for his whole life. And here the man in black says, I'm not blaming you, right? It's like, again, this isn't the surface meaning of this exchange, right? But like the sort of the double meaning of these words, it's almost like the man in black, this mysterious figure who's the protagonist in whose path Fezzik is supposed to be an obstacle, is extending a word. Again, you can say, I'm not blaming you, right? Again, just sort of batting aside that particular piece of badinage, but there's almost an implicit sympathy there. Again, the double meaning is an implicit sympathy, which he never received even from his own parents, right? And that's kind of beautiful. That's kind of lovely. Yeah. Thomas Johnson says, Wesley sounds like a therapist there. I'm not blaming you, right? Yeah. Good. Mary Rose says that with Fezzik's mentality, gentleness, that is to say, gentleness, his strength is highlighted as a disability, right? Yeah, almost to him, right? Very good. Excellent. So again, notice what happens here. Again, for both of them, in this moment, when they come to this crossroads in their career and their meeting of the man in black, both of them, but they don't get exactly their heart's desire. That is, it's not like they find the end of their quest, but if you want to look at this as like a journey for discovering their true identity, or whatever, for like getting in touch with themselves, this is a turning point for both of them. Right? Both of them get what they were looking for. Inigo gets a challenge that he can't overcome. Right? His life has meaning again and is not worthless and pointless and boring. Fezzik gets what he always wanted. He loses, so that he is not being booed by the crowds, and he doesn't have to hurt and kill Wesley, which he doesn't want to do. But he's not going to disobey Vizzini either. Okay. Then our next stage in the careers of our two heroes is what I call the pit of despair. That is what happens to both of them. When we return to both of them, in some ways unexpectedly, after they wake up from the unconsciousness in which Wesley leaves them, what happens to the two of them? And both of them here descend into their lowest moments. Here's Inigo first. Inigo moved panicked up the dark streets, desperately afraid. Why his giant fear? What was he afraid of? He sat on a filthy stoop and pondered. Around him there were cries in the night, and from the alehouses vulgar laughter. He was afraid, he realized then, because as he sat there, gripping the six-fingered sword for confidence, he was suddenly back to what he had been before Vizzini had found him. A failure. A man without point, with no attachment to tomorrow. Inigo had not touched brandy in years. Now he felt his fingers fumbling for money. Now he heard his footsteps running toward the nearest alehouse. Now he saw his money on the counter. Now he felt the brandy bottle in his hands. Back to the stoop he ran. He opened the bottle. He smelled the rough brandy. He took a sip. He coughed. He took a swallow. He coughed again. He gulped it down and coughed and gulped some more and half began a smile. His fears were starting to leave him. Again, notice none of that sardonic tone, right? We're not invited to laugh anywhere here, right? We get this earnest, detailed description of his situation. We get that really fascinating narrative shift, right, where we get him in this almost this passive. It's not exactly. Grammatically, it's not the passive voice, but it's like the passive voice, right? He's not doing anything. He feels his fingers fumbling for money. He hears his footsteps running. He sees his money on the counter. He feels the brandy bottle in his hands. We don't see him too. We see these things sort of happening. He observes these things happening around him, right? There's this sense of inevitability. He can't, having been, feeling that he is a failure, that he has no attachment to tomorrow. He's back, down in this sort of lowest place, and the horrible irony of that last line, his fears were starting to leave him, right? Because he's drunk himself to insensibility, as Tom Hillman says, he's lost himself there. Yeah, and as he succeeds in getting himself lost, he ceases to be afraid, and his ceasing to be afraid is sort of the most horrible, the most pitiable thing that happens to him here. Good. Both Kate Neville and Philip Lord are both saying it's a touching description of of addiction, of alcoholism. Really, it's very human. There's nothing funny about this at all. How about Fezzik? When Fezzik reached the cliffs of insanity, he said, "Inigo, Inigo, here I am," to the rocks. First of all, can I confess that I'm cheating here? One thing that I want to point out even before I begin, notice how Fezzik, when the narrator gives us Fezzik's internal monologue, Fezzik's internal monologue, or like when the description is following Fezzik really closely, it's like run-on sentence heaven, right? I mean, he just goes on and on and on and on and on. The sentences are interminable. So I've cheated. I'm actually joining the sentence midway. It's like more than halfway through the sentence already when I started. But again, I wanted to fit it on the slide. When Fezzik reached the cliffs of insanity, he said, "Inigo, Inigo, here I am," to the rocks, and "I'm here, Inigo, it's your Fezzik," to the trees, and "Inigo, Inigo, answer me, please," all over until there was no other conclusion to draw, but that just as there was now no Vizzini, so there was also no Inigo, and that was hard. It was, in point of fact, too hard for Fezzik, so he began to run, crying out, "Be with you in a minute, Inigo," and "Right behind you, Inigo," and "Hey, Inigo, wait up, straight up," which was the way he ran, and wouldn't there be fun with rhymes once he and Inigo were together again. But after an hour or so of shouting, his throat gave out, because he had, after all, been strangled almost to death in the very recent past. On he ran, on and on and on, until finally he reached a tiny village and found, just outside town, some nice rocks that formed a kind of cave, almost big enough for him to stretch out in. He sat with his back against a rock, and his hands around his knees, and his throat hurting, until the village boys found him. And then, of course, we get the touching and horrible description of the village boys initially being afraid and slowly building up their confidence until they start jeering at him and yelling at him, and then that terrible, terrible last line, "At least they weren't throwing rocks yet." Right? Fezzik, too, goes back to his lowest point, right? Fezzik is alone, and being left alone is the worst thing. That's his version of hell. Carita, I agree. It's your Fezzik is so, so sad. It is so touching. The warmth and kindness and gentleness of Fezzik's character, this kind of unreserve, the completeness of his devotion to his friend, the completely unself-conscious care and love and dependence upon his friend is so charming in Fezzik. And again, I can't help but find both Wesley and Buttercup cold fishes in comparison to Fezzik and to Inigo, but especially to Fezzik. Good. Alyssa points out, I love how the cliffs of insanity are functioning as a metaphor when Fezzik is almost going mad. Absolutely. Yeah, he's reaching the cliffs of insanity in a metaphorical as well as a literal sense. Absolutely. Absolutely. Philip Lord says, Inigo and Fezzik are in a figurative pit of despair, while Wesley is literally in a pit of despair. Absolutely. It's not called the Pit of Despair in the book. It's called the Zoo of Death. But still, no, you're right. I mean, he is in a cage at his lowest point, presumably. We know less about Wesley's life than we know about Fezzik and Inigo's life, so it's hard to tell. But, I think it's fair to say that moment, when he's in the cage in the Zoo of Death, is probably Wesley's lowest point. But again, I don't know. I care so much more about Fezzik and Inigo. Good. Good. Ian Blaylock points out that Fezzik completely demolishes the giant stereotypes of fairy tales. And he's a well-rounded character too. Yeah, absolutely. There are always giants in fairy tales. Not always, but there are many giants in fairy tales, right? And Fezzik is... But again, notice the departure. And the departure is of a very different kind. Then, we get the playing with, the true love conventions and those times when we were invited to laugh at Buttercup and Wesley at the beginning and stuff, which again looks like a kind of a send-up of the, sort of the true love tropes of fairy tale stories. We don't get that kind of treatment with Fezzik. It is a reversal. It can be taken in that sense satirically, as a fairy tale satire, that is to say. But gosh, it certainly doesn't feel anything like that kind of, I keep using the word sardonic because for tonight anyway. That's my word to try to describe Morgenstern's tone, especially as he deals with Buttercup and Wesley, and in particular in those early chapters. Okay, so this is stage 3. So we have their shattered childhoods, the crossroads, the turning points of their career, the pit of despair. Then we have them emerging from the pit of despair, and them coming themselves from the pit of despair. And the time that I would point to as being the times that I would point to as being especially important for them, even though they've already kind of pulled them, so they find each other, which is of course the really important thing. That's the sort of the real turning point when both of them begin to get their lives back together. Of course, Inigo very graphically as he's being sobered up by Fezzik, again the tender ministrations of Fezzik for his friend. But the moment that I really wanted to isolate is when they face their fears as they are descending into the zoo of death. The terror that they experience, the way in which the trip of Inigo and Fezzik into the zoo of death is treated as... I mean, it's hard for me not to read that as a kind of metaphor, or at least as a parallel to the trajectory of their characters, right? They have, descended down into darkness, but now they're going. I mean, it's like a descent into the underworld motif, right, from the epic tradition. Almost, Tom. It's not quite the same, right? I'm appealing to Tom Hillman, our resident classicist, but anyway, it's like that, and they're facing the darkness, and there's so much emphasis on their fears and their terror, and yet both of them confront their fears and emerge from there with a kind of, and again here I end up sounding really probably very Columbia academic again, but they emerge with a sort of a clearer sense of themselves, in as much as we can see the trajectory of their own sort of understanding of themselves, of their own, the evolution of their own identities and their own understanding of those things. Those moments on the stairs in the Zoo of Death strike me as really important. Here's Inigo fighting the bats when he takes charge and decides that he's not going to let them die in the dark, as Fezzik is completely incapacitated by his fear of the king bats. Apparently, in Turkey, "Here come the king bats" being the most terrifying phrase that anyone can utter. The sword was heavy now. 3 dead beasts changed the balance, and Inigo wanted to clear the weapon, but now another flutter, a single one, and no veering this time, straight and deadly for his face, and he ducked and was lucky. The sword moved up and into the heart of the lethal thing, and now there were 4 skewered on the sword of legend, and Inigo knew that he was not about to lose this fight, and from his throat came the words, "I am Inigo Montoya, and still the wizard. Come for me!" And when he heard 3 of them fluttering, he wished he had been just a bit more modest, but it was too late for that, so he needed surprise, and he took it, shifting position against the beasts, standing straight, taking their dives long before they expected it, and now there were 7 king bats, and his sword was completely out of balance, and that would have been a bad thing, a dangerous thing, except for one important aspect. There was silence now in the darkness. The fluttering was done. Notice that this passage is exactly 2 sentences long. The fluttering was done is sentence 2, and the entire rest of the passage is sentence number 1. Exactly, Kate. It runs on in the same way that Fezzik's so often do. This is in part a technique to show the rapid pace of the action, the sort of breathless moment of Inigo trying to fight the bats. Good, Kate, we see how the 2 of them have strengths that help the other. We see each one of them incapacitated and the other one being able to rescue him. And again, in this moment, Inigo asserting himself. He is briefly overcome with terror. He doesn't know what he's going to do. And then he remembers his training, right? And he recalls Macpherson, the cranky Scot, who trained him, and all the different training that he gave and the training that he got for fighting blind, and decides to, that he needs to be who he is, be who he's been trained to be, until finally he declares, "I am Inigo Montoya and still the wizard." Yeah, good. Mary Rose says he wishes he was a bit more modest while challenging the creatures. Yeah, exactly. Now that is a moment. Notice we do get a couple moments that I would qualify as the things I've been saying are not present in Inigo's passages so far. We do get a couple moments here where Morgenstern is being funny, right? Where he's making the sort of sardonic comments at the expense of the character. That's one of them, right? He wished he had been just a bit more modest, but it was too late for that, so he needed surprise and he took it. That's a little kind of little comical detour from in the middle of that long thing, of that long, otherwise sort of dramatic and quite literally breathless description. Yeah, good. Yeah, Nancy says that and the sword full of skewered bats. Yes, that is a little bit funny. The visual image, ironically, the visual image that we're being given in the complete darkness. But good. Kate says that she asks, might we conclude that they are lending emotional strengths as well? Inigo is becoming more emotional like Fezzik, whereas Fezzik becomes more calculating like Inigo. I'm thinking of his finding the horses. Yeah, at the end we'll see him sort of being more calculating like Inigo. Yeah, good. Michael Chevskovsky says the long sentences that we get, in these passages are almost precisely the opposite of the parenthetical interruptions we saw earlier in the book. I agree, Michael. I assume you mean opposite in the sense of their effect on us, right? With the interruptions disrupting our investment in what's going on, and remember Goldman, the frame narrator's own interpretation of the parentheses was that it was Morgenstern signaling to us this isn't real. Right, and certainly whether or not that's explicitly what Morgenstern is saying in the sense of this is fiction, this is it is inescapably, I think, a way in which it is made to feel less real. The emotional impact is much lessened. So I agree, Michael. The rapid fire impact, the drama of the run-on sentence here, the emotional pain of the Fezzik run-on sentence earlier on, they are, I agree, in their narrative effect precisely the opposite of those interruptions. Fezzik's moment in the Zoo of Death. Both of them being strangled by the snake, and Inigo has just said, "I had so many rhymes for you, Fezzik," right? Inigo, I want to know the rhymes before I die. Inigo, I really want to know. Inigo, tell me the rhymes, Fezzik said, and by now he was very frustrated, and more than that, he was spectacularly angry, and one arm came clear of one coil, and that made it a bit less of a chore to fight free of the second coil, and that meant that he could take that arm and bring it to the aid of the other arm, and now he was yelling it out, "You're not going anywhere until I know those rhymes," and the sound of his own voice was really very impressive, deep and resonant, and who was this snake anyway, getting in the path of Fezzik when there were rhymes to learn? And by this time not only were both arms free of the bottom three coils, but he was furious at the interruption, and his hands grabbed toward the snake breath, and he didn't know if snakes had necks or not, but whatever it was that you called that part that was under its mouth, that was the part that he had between his great hands, and he gave it a smash against the wall, and the snake hissed and spit, but the fourth coil was looser, so Fezzik smashed it again, and a third time, and then brought his hands back for a bit of leverage, and he began to whip the beast against the walls like a native washerwoman beginning to beat a skirt against rocks. And when the snake was dead, Inigo said, "Actually, I had no specific rhymes in mind. I just had to do something to get you into action." One sentence. Good. Kate Neville says, "My name is Fezzik. Prepare to rhyme." Yeah. Mary Rose points out that it's possibly the first time that Fezzik becomes angry and makes demands. Yes, we never see him saying things like, "Tell me the rhymes. You're not going anywhere until I know the rhymes." Yes, we see him becoming very emotional, right? We've seen him becoming emotional before. This is a different emotion, right? We see him becoming very angry. We see him breaking out. We see him inflicting deliberate harm. He almost never does this, right? Fezzik, even when he's confronted, even when his own life seems at stake, really doesn't want to fight. He gives the man in black, just as it seems to me that Inigo, part of him, at least secretly, kind of wishes that he would be bested, right? He would like to know that there's somebody better than him, that he still has something to strive for. And this is why he's praying for the men in black to be a master and for him to be challenged. So to Fezzik, I think, in perhaps even a less secret part of his mind, really wants to lose. He's giving the man in black a chance, a fair chance, not just because he likes sportsmanship in general and adheres to an honorable code rather than the dishonorable and unsportsmanlike way that Vizzini wants him to kill the man in black. But again, also because he would really quite rather not kill this man, and it seems like maybe he has a better chance of not killing him if he goes that way. The violence that Fezzik unleashes against the giant snake is unlike any violence we see him unleash anywhere else. It is the most eager and thoroughgoing violence that we ever see Fezzik indulge in. And again, this is Fezzik asserting himself. And it's the first time we ever see Fezzik asserting himself from his early days as a child, when he tries to assert himself at the beginning in that passage that we were looking at before. "I won't go into the arena. I won't go." And his parents threatening to leave him behind and to leave him alone. And we almost never see him assert himself after that. Now he asserts himself. And he asserts himself, and again, just as Inigo is there saying, "I am still the wizard," right? So Fezzik, force is his domain, right? And he is not going to be over-forced by a snake. Yeah, good. Yep, Sarah Powell is saying that, Inigo is inspired to protect Fezzik against the bats, and Fezzik is inspired in anger to save Inigo. Agreed. We do see a nice symmetry there. Again, it's another thing that's really cool. It's not just that their careers are in parallel like this, but the similarities between them and the interconnectedness of their journey seems to me really, really fascinating. Okay, good. Rachel Draper says, "It's interesting that Inigo doesn't threaten Fezzik in order to inspire him to action. Instead, he entices." Yes, he holds out in front of him. It might seem strange under the circumstance to say that he gives Fezzik a reason to live. Fezzik seems to be almost giving up. He's so paralyzed by his fear that he doesn't... Inigo has just been saying, "Fight back, Fezzik," right? "We're being suffocated by this snake, but you're stronger than anything, right? So surely you do something." And Fezzik is like, I can't. It's only when Inigo says, "I have so many rhymes for you," right? That the prospect of the many rhymes, which doesn't take much generalizing to see. Remember, it was the rhymes. The rhymes were at least sort of the symbol or the emblem, sort of the representative of that life of camaraderie, that life of friendship that he sought in Inigo, that he was seeking so desperately as he was, Alyssa, as you say, sort of hurtling towards the cliffs of insanity, right? That's what rhymes mean to him, right? We see how he associates rhymes with Inigo, and he's always thinking about the rhyming that they will do together. It's like, in saying that he had so many rhymes for him, what Inigo is sort of holding out to him is like, imagine the lifetime of friendship and rhyming we could have together if you would only bestir yourself and destroy the snake that's killing us both, right? Fezzik has something to live for. And he makes a choice, right? He asserts himself, and he chooses life, he chooses friendship, he chooses rhyming. He's not just going to die. He's not just going to be this passive creature that he's generally been ever since his parents abused him as a child, right? And instead, he doesn't change. I mean, you say, well, so he becomes the super strong giant. He's always been the super strong giant. Yeah, but it's different now. Yeah, good. Okay. Then what happens? I want to look, of course, at so they've descended into the underworld and overcome their fears. Now, the ending, the climax. Where do their stories end up? With Inigo, of course. We know where it is. It was really hard to pick a passage from his fight with Count Rugen. Here's the best I could find that pointed to as many of the things I wanted to talk about as I could find in one place. Count Rugen was a bit surprised that his point had been deflected, but there was nothing wrong with piercing a helpless man's shoulder. There was no hurry when you had him. Remember, this is, of course, Count Rugen, Mr. I'm writing a treatise on pain. Macpherson was screaming again. Spaniards! Give me a Pollock any time! At least the Pollocks remember to use the wall when they have one. Only the Spaniards would forget to use a wall. Slowly, inch by inch, Inigo forced his body up the wall, using his legs just for pushing, letting the wall do all the supporting that was necessary. Count Rugen struck again, but for any number of reasons, most probably because he hadn't expected the other man's movement, he missed the heart and had to be content with driving his blade through the Spaniard's left arm. Inigo didn't mind. He didn't even feel it. His right arm was where his interest lay, and he squeezed the handle, and there was strength in his hand, enough to flick out at the enemy, and Count Rugen hadn't expected that either, so he gave a little involuntary cry and took a step back to reassess the situation. Power was flowing up from Inigo's heart to his right shoulder, and down from his shoulder to his fingers, and then into the great six-fingered sword, and he pushed off from the wall. Then, with a whispered, "Hello, my name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father. Prepare to die." And they crossed swords. Begin, as he would have said when he was 10. What do we see here? In this, and of course, the rest of this scene, in the climax of his career, right? The fulfillment of his goals. What do we see? Sarah Good, we see him up against an impossible challenge, right? We saw him choosing to fight the man in black left-handed because it would be over too quickly if he fought with his right, right? He wanted to give the man in black a chance and make it a challenge, right? So we see him rising here when he's been gutted by the knife of Count Rugen, and can barely stand and is bleeding to death. But yeah, so we see him when he's facing that kind of challenge. Here we see him, rise up and conquer that. Again, it's like going back to his conflict with Wesley, but we see him going beyond it, having gone through the journey back down into the pit of despair and descending to the underworld and overcoming his fears. He is still the wizard, right? Remembers his training, the voice of Macpherson in his mind, which seems to be sort of connected with his wizardliness, right? All of the things that he has learned, all of the masters he learned from. Yes, Kate, the unashamedly romantic moment. Power was flowing up from Inigo's heart to his right shoulder and down from his shoulder to his fingers and then into the great six-fingered sword, and he pushed off the wall with a whispered hello. The power flowing up from his heart, right? There's a lot of emphasis on hearts in this scene, but of course, again, notice no shade of, we're not laughing. Nobody's laughing now, right? There's nothing funny about this. There's no sardonic tone. There's no aside. There's no parentheses. And instead, what we get instead is this almost fairy tale, almost straight up fairy tale language, right? This power that's coming from his heart as he is finally as he's reaching down into, his heart and his love and his memory for his father and his desire to avenge it. I mean, all these things which could sound really, really corny if we wanted to make them sound, really cloying and cliche. But they don't. I think it works. It works really well. Good. Of course, Brianna points out that the fight starting with the unexpected dagger throw puts the Count in direct contrast to the honorable swordsmanship of Inigo and Wesley. Exactly, we see that being, in that sense, kind of the reversal of the initial conflict between Wesley and Inigo, and a nice contrast there. But of course, we see Inigo overcoming this, and as Philip points out, it starts with the running away, right? The sort of stunning anticlimax of the initial conflict, or that is of the initial confrontation, when he finally confronts his father's murderer, and his father's murderer just turns and run away. We're told earlier that he had envisioned at many times, he'd fantasized about what that would look like, right? And he'd imagined many different scenarios. But the scenario that he was sort of most fond of, the image, how he really kind of hoped it would go, is that the Count would acknowledge the fact, like, yes, I killed your father, and they would fight, right? And they would have a duel, and it would be a duel, right? Not a killing. It would be a duel, and he would overcome him fairly and honorably, and he would avenge his father's spirit. And of course, we see the double way in which Count Rugen vastly disappoints those expectations. Yes. Several people are pointing out that Count Rugen seems to find Inigo's continued resistance inconceivable. Absolutely, he does. Yeah, good. So where does Inigo end up? And of course here I'm even referring very explicitly to the parts that I haven't put on this passage here. When he finally kills Count Rugen, Count Rugen's death is kind of beautiful in its way, right? Inigo is saying, we both appreciate justice, right? And he is stabbing him next to his heart and below his heart, and says to Count Rugen, do you see what I'm doing? Do you know what I'm doing? And Count Rugen says, you're cutting out my heart. And Inigo says, yes, that's exactly what I'm doing. You cut out my heart on that day when you killed my father. This is only just. But it's just in ways that he himself doesn't understand. Wherein lies the justice of Count Rugen's death? It's beautiful. The justice of it is beautiful. What kills him? What's the COD? What's the coroner going to put on Count Rugen's death certificate? If they had a coroner. Fear! Yes, Philip. The fear kills him. What's the heart of pain? According to Count Rugen himself, the expert. It's the heart of pain. The central element of pain. Philip, exactly. Anticipation. Right? The anticipation. Inigo saying, I am halfway through cutting your heart out now, right? And with the anticipation of the torment, he dies, right? He just can't handle it, and his heart stops, and he gives out. Yes, exactly. As Kate Neville says, the student of pain learns the final lesson. The elegance of the death of Count Rugen, balanced against Count Rugen's torture of Wesley, is gorgeous. I mean, it's really lovely in that way. And it might sound weird for me to be using words like lovely and gorgeous to describe the bloody murder, revenge killing of the Count in the end. But it's that connection to his torture of Wesley that makes it, in my mind, really, really poetic, because it's beyond even Inigo's. Inigo is thinking he's thinking poetically as well, right? He's literalizing a metaphor, right? You ripped out my heart metaphorically on that day. I'm going to rip out your heart literally on this day to sort of balance out the metaphors. He's thinking in explicitly poetic terms in his vengeance, but the vengeance, the actual death of Count Rugen, is far more poetic than he himself, and far more just and fitting than he himself even realizes. And it's almost nice, in a sense, that he actually doesn't kill Count Rugen. He's not a killer. You know, that insult at the heart of that chiastic fivefold insult that he gave Count Rugen as a 10-year-old, that is when Inigo was a 10-year-old, he's not a killer, right? He doesn't want to kill Wesley, and he doesn't kill... Yes, of course, he inflicted wounds which would certainly have been mortal, but it wasn't the wounds that were the cause of death. Ultimately, the cause of death was fear and pain, exactly the instruments that Count Rugen himself had been so, manifold is an adjective. There needs to be an adverb. I want to say manifoldly guilty before. There you go, manifoldly. There's my word of the day, the adjectival form of manifold. Yeah, good. Okay, and all right. So Inigo has a happy ending. Happy ending certainly in that he accomplishes his life goal of avenging his father. But of course, a journey for revenge is one that always, or rather, that never can be truly and perfectly satisfying, as Inigo himself verbalizes in that final moment, right? Offer me anything I ask for. I want Domingo Montoya, right? I want my father. And he can't have that, right? And killing Count Rugen is going to bring his father back. His own heart was cut out on that day when he was 10. Cutting out Count Rugen's heart is going to give his own heart back, right? So in that sense, the quest for vengeance is always ultimately empty, can never really be satisfying. But again, even that lack of satisfaction is acknowledged there in the end. And the fact that he is joined with Fezzik, and incidentally, by the way, also to Wesley and Buttercup. There are these two other characters that tag along with Fezzik and Inigo at the end. But again, this gives us, that's wherein the satisfaction really lies, right? His reunion with Fezzik really is like the final happy ending of Inigo's career here. Had he just been alone, had he been pursuing, Count Rugen, as he did through the years independently, and then found him and killed him in the street, and then what? What would he do? Wander off and drink himself to death with brandy? Probably. I mean, what else is there to live for? He still wouldn't have his father back, and he would have no longer purpose, no goal, no purpose, nothing, a failure, right? Well, no, he would be succeeding, but still, then now where would he go? But now he's saved. Now he has a happy ending because he has somewhere else to go and someone else to go to. Yeah. How about Fezzik? Fezzik's end, of course, is in the one sense less dramatic, as he does not have a big culminating thing. There's been this obvious goal of Inigo's trajectory, right? As he's been on this quest, which has spanned decades, the vast majority of his life. Fezzik doesn't have any such concrete quest or any concrete end to accomplish, and yet, nevertheless, he does have an interesting sort of endpoint to his own particular trajectory. Tom Hillman points out, by the way, one last comment on Inigo there, that it's fascinating. Tom says that Inigo's revenge doesn't end in tragedy. You could call this a revenge comedy, and Tom, I agree. Those are comparatively unusual revenge comedies. Yeah. Normally you end up with more bodies strewn around and Tom, it looks like it's going that way, right? I mean, he's like half disemboweled. He's like putting his fist inside his abdominal wall, holding his guts in during the fight. I mean, you more than half expect, I at least 3/4 expect him to kill Count Rugen successfully and then keel over dead, right? But he doesn't keel over dead. So it's Karita, I'm not making that up. It talks about that. It doesn't use the medical terms. But remember, there's that moment where the narrator describes like him reaching his fist further into the wound and feeling like the squishy things and not wanting to think about what he was touching with his hand, right? I mean, we could have pretty clearly described his hand going inside the abdominal wall and touching his intestines. It's a little gross, but there we are. Tom says, "Is that the difference between drama and fairy tale right there?" Maybe, like stage drama. You mean you're thinking about with revenge, tragedy, and so I assume you're thinking about Shakespeare, for instance. Yeah, perhaps. But again, I mean, I think it's a really important point, Tom, that we get. Inigo gets a fairy tale ending. And it has many of the sort of the detachment from reality. He should be bleeding to death. Even if he succeeds in killing Count Rugen, he should be bleeding to death. We don't even see him getting proper medical treatment afterwards. Presumably, after he staggers off down the hall and finds Wesley and Buttercup, he's then going to leap down the 20-foot window down to be caught by Fezzik with a punctured, more than punctured, abdominal wall, right? And then ride off on horseback. All without even the flow of blood apparently being effectually staunched, much less anything else. It's a fairy tale ending, right? We're invited to forget about that. And we do. I think we do forget about that. Anyway, that's it's, as I said at the beginning, the story of Fezzik and Inigo are like unapologetically romantic and fairy tale like. They're the ones that have the adventure. They're like the fairy tale heroes that go through and that win and live probably happily ever after. We don't know. We'll come back to happily ever after next time, but yeah. Anyway, Fezzik. I was just talking about Fezzik. I was trying to transition to Fezzik here before I got drawn back. Okay. This is, of course, Fezzik showing up outside the window with the horses. Fezzik said, "Oh, Inigo, I need you, please, Inigo." This is him recounting where he was when he came back and found Inigo was gone, and he comes back and finds Wesley gone, and he's all on his own, and chooses the wrong corridor and wanders off the wrong direction. "Oh, Inigo, I need you, please, Inigo. I'm lost and miserable and frightened, and I just need to see a friendly face." They moved slowly to the window. Wandering lost and forlorn through the prince's garden was Fezzik, leaving the 4 giant whites. "Here," Inigo whispered. "3 friendly faces," Fezzik said, kind of bouncing up and down on his heels, which he always did when things were looking up. How adorable is Fezzik! "Oh, Inigo, I just ruined everything, and I got so lost, and when I stumbled into the stables and found these pretty horses, I thought 4 was how many of them there were, and 4 was how many of us there were, too, if we found the lady. Hello, lady. And I thought, why not take them along with me in case we all ever run into each other?" He stopped a moment, considering. "And I guess we did." Inigo was terribly excited. "Fezzik, you thought for yourself," he said. Fezzik considered that a moment, too. "Does that mean you're not mad at me for getting lost?" Nancy Fosberg thinks that "hello, lady" is a really great line. I agree. Hello, lady. Yeah. It's an aside which invites us to laugh with Fezzik and not at him, right? Notice at the beginning we see Fezzik reprising his role briefly at the top of the Cliffs of Insanity. Here's Fezzik, he's left alone again, right? He finds that he's lost everyone, and he feels like he's screwed everything up. It's worse, in a sense, almost worse than the Cliffs of Insanity. Less bad because he had more reason to think it was permanent, right? He had seen the Man in Black coming, presumably had just killed Inigo. He knew that Inigo was going to duel him to the death if he got up the cliff. So the fact that he's coming probably means that Inigo is dead. And we see earlier on, before the passage that we read, that Fezzik was actively trying not to think about the fact that Inigo was probably dead. He found Vizzini's actual corpse, so he knows that Vizzini is dead. And so his solitude there after he awakes is far more profound and, as far as he can tell, permanent. He has nobody left, and he may never have anybody anymore. His solitude here is less permanent, and therefore his despair seems to be less complete. And yet there's an element here that wasn't there before, which is that he feels personally culpable, that like he screwed everything up somehow because he lost everybody. He got lost, right? And yet he just needs to see a friendly face, and behold, 3 friendly faces, as he says. And all of a sudden he goes from despair to bouncing up and down on his heels, right? Fezzik has a happy ending too, where, far from being left alone, he not only is reunited with Inigo, but also with Wesley and Buttercup. He finds not just 1, but 3 friendly faces. And that's where his trajectory ends. And what's more, we see him, it's not just that he thinks of himself, of course, as a failure. He thinks of himself that he can't ever do, that he can never do anything right? Which, of course, we know to be untrue. We can see him, his kindness and gentleness and generosity and tenderness and loyalty and all of these things are, of course, very good things, and we see him doing lots of good things. But he doesn't have that own sense of himself, right? His own self-image is still like the child whom everybody picks on because of something that he can't help, right? That he's just intrinsically a failure and there's nothing he can do, right? It's not my fault that I'm the biggest and the strongest, right? It's not my fault that I'm the biggest and the strongest. He couldn't help it. He's done something right? And we end here with Fezzik, and with Inigo's excitement, right? You thought for yourself, right? Look, you did a good thing. It's just beautiful. And as Kate points out, we see Fezzik reunited with family, right? Fezzik sort of is like getting the family he didn't have. He does treat Inigo like a father, but of course it's also, with Wesley and Buttercup here, it's almost like now the 4 of them are like a family, right? He has Inigo, and he does treat Inigo like a father at times, but I don't know. I mean, it's like, who's the, we've got the potential parent figures, who come in. I don't know, but anyway, it is like a family that he's joined with here at the end, and I think that's really important. And again, a beautiful end to the arc, seeing where their arcs began. Sarah King says he's probably been thinking for himself the whole time. He's just not very proactive. No, yeah, exactly. He's certainly not assertive, right? Assertive is one of the words we were using before. But again, of course he's been thinking for himself. Look at how he, found and took and healed, I guess you could say, Inigo, right? When he found Inigo drunk. He was doing all the thinking and planning there, right? He doesn't give himself any credit for it. But again here, nor is he sort of praised and made to realize that he did something right? Sarah Powell says that she thinks both Inigo and Fezzik have humility, though Inigo hides his in brandy, which pushes them to do better, but Buttercup lacks that, which is why we're less sympathetic to her. Possibly. Well, we'll come back to Buttercup and Wesley next time. Let me advance to the next slide, because here's something you don't see every week. Oh, End of slideshow. I did them all. How about that? This concludes, on time, our discussion of Fezzik and Inigo. And I have to tell you, inconceivable, says Tom Hillman. Very good, very good. Anyway, no, Sarah Powell, it's not quite a first, but I will say it's rather unusual. Anyway, I'm getting roundly teased in the questions box here. Anyway, I have to say that I have been, my looking at Inigo and Fezzik, spending some time really thinking and looking at Inigo and Fezzik, has definitely changes my outlook on the story as a whole. I still think that if we had nothing in the story other than Buttercup and Wesley, I wouldn't be a fan. Now, the question that I'm going to want to be asking as we move into next week and to the questions that we have to deal with next week, not only do we have to kind of resolve the Buttercup and Wesley situation as far as their characters are concerned, but as I said, I want to be looking at where we end up on the whole at the end of the story, with Morgenstern, with the barber, as he calls him, his dad, with the Goldman narrator, where we end and why we end that way and where all of this leaves us. What I'm going to what I'm especially going to be interested in asking, in light of what we've been talking about today, is where does this stuff fit in? It would be easier to draw conclusions about this story if all we did have were Wesley and Buttercup. It would be a far infinitely less enjoyable story, but it would be a little bit easier to draw conclusions. Several of you are asking me if we're going to talk about Buttercup's baby. All right, I will confess, I had been kind of hoping nobody would bring up Buttercup's baby, and I could avoid it. I will admit I was kind of hoping that. But Kat Sass tweeted me about that before we even did class number 1, and I was like, oh, it's not going to work. So we'll probably talk about Buttercup's baby. I doubt we'll have time next time. I'm not sure that I want to add an entire extra class to talk about Buttercup's baby, but anyway, we'll probably get to it. Maybe. How's that for a definitive answer to that question? I don't think I want to spend much time on it. Anyway, read it if you get a chance, because we may come to it some next time. Anyway, well, I did no promises for next time, but I probably won't leave it entirely out either. Anyway, thank you very much for joining me on this momentous occasion when I am here. We are all confronted with the plain visual evidence of the black screen here, and I look forward to it. Next week, I'm going to be on the road again. I'm going to be in Charlotte, so I'm going to be broadcasting from my little apartment room. I trust everything's going to be okay. I'm planning to hold class as usual. I did class from the same room last year, and I should be able to there shouldn't be a serious problem, but there will be some. I won't have my nice backdrop behind me next week. But anyway, we should be able to proceed as predicted and get towards the ending of the story and solving all the riddles for next time. Won't that be nice, as the king in the movie says. Thanks, everybody. Good night. See you next week.